There was a man walking along a track in the south of England sometime around the year 900, carrying a bundle of goods on his back that he intended to sell at a market 2 days' travel ahead of him. He knew the way not because anyone had drawn it for him, and not because he carried any document describing it, but because he had walked it before. And before that he had walked it with his father, and the track itself had been worn into the ground by enough feet over enough years that its existence was self-evident to anyone who found it. He stopped at a place where the track divided. Both paths were worn, both continued into the landscape ahead, and both looked as though they received regular use. He stood there for a moment. He had not been to this particular fork before. The light was coming from the southwest, which told him the time of day and also the direction. He was heading roughly north. One of the tracks curved away to the left and slightly downhill toward what appeared to be a line of willows in the middle distance, which suggested a river. The other continued at roughly his current heading through open land. He took the right-hand track and kept walking. He would get where he was going, or he would not. If he did not, he would ask someone, or he would recognize something he had heard described, or he would follow the river he could hear somewhere to his left until it led him somewhere he knew. Getting lost in a landscape where you were traveling was not the catastrophe it can seem from a later perspective. It was one of the ordinary contingencies of travel, managed through accumulated experience, through asking, through reading the land itself, and through the simple persistence of continuing to move in a direction that seemed broadly correct. This is a narration about how people found their way before maps were widely available, and before the assumption that a map existed for every place and every journey became a normal part of how travel was planned and conducted. It is a narration about the systems of knowledge and the practical skills that people use to orient themselves in the world, and about the texture of travel and movement through a landscape that was known differently from how it is known today. The idea that a map is the natural way to represent geographical knowledge is a relatively recent one. For most of human history, in most places, the knowledge of how to get from one place to another was held in people's heads, rather than on paper or any other surface, and it was transmitted through conversation, through accompanied walking, through story, and through the gradual accumulation of personal experience over a lifetime. This is not to say that maps did not exist before the modern period. They did in various forms, and in certain contexts they were important and valued documents. But the maps that existed before the widespread development of cartography in the early modern period were different from modern maps in ways that go beyond the obvious differences of accuracy and completeness. They were different in their underlying conception of what a map was for and what information it should contain. A medieval road map, for instance, if one existed for a particular journey, was often not a geometrically accurate representation of space at all. It was more like a list of places in order, connected by indications of direction and rough distance, with notes about particular features or hazards along the way. The Gauss map, made in England in the 14th century and one of the earliest surviving maps to show recognizable road routes, is geometrically very approximate by modern standards, with distances and directions that do not match the actual landscape with precision. But as a guide to the sequence of places along a route and the approximate relationships between them, it conveyed useful information in a form that could be read and used. Most travelers, however, did not have even this kind of document. They had the knowledge in their heads, obtained from other people, and they navigated through a landscape that was understood as a network of places connected by paths, rather than as a continuous surface with coordinates. The knowledge required to travel without maps was not simple, and it was not acquired quickly. It was the product of years of movement through a landscape, of listening to other people's descriptions of their own journeys, of the gradual accumulation of understanding about how places related to each other and what the landscape between them contained. A person who had grown up in a particular region of England in the 10th century would have known that region in considerable detail. They would have known the names of fields and hills and streams that no map of any later period would record. They would have known which paths flooded in winter, which stretches of road were prone to making the going heavy after rain, where the track passed through woodland that required more attention to navigation than the open stretches, and where it passed by landmarks that confirmed you were on the right course. This knowledge was organized in the mind differently from the way a map organizes information. A map presents all of its information simultaneously, arranged spatially, so that the viewer can see relationships between places that are not on the same route. The mental knowledge of a landscape built up through travel was organized more sequentially, along routes, with the relationships between different routes less immediately apparent than on a map, but no less real. The word itinerary captures something of this sequential organization. An itinerary, in its older sense, is a sequence of places to be passed through on a journey, listed in order, with the practical information relevant to moving between them. The Romans produced itineraries of this kind for the road network of the empire, the Antonine itinerary being the best known, and the genre persisted through the medieval period and into the early modern era. These documents were not maps, but they served a navigational function, giving the traveler the sequence of named places to follow and rough indications of the distances between them. The value of an itinerary depended on the existence of named places along the route that a traveler could identify by asking locals. If you knew that the next place you were headed toward was called Wotton, and you could stop at any settlement along the way and ask if you were on the right road to Wotton, the itinerary gave you what you needed. The names of places were the essential infrastructure of pre-map navigation, and the density of settlement in a landscape was directly relevant to how easily a traveler could keep themselves oriented. In more densely settled regions, the density of named places along routes was sufficient to make this kind of asked and answered navigation work reasonably well. Southern England, northern France, the lowlands of the Low Countries, the plains of northern Italy, all of these were landscapes where settlements were spaced close enough together that a traveler on any significant route could expect to reach a village or a farmstead within a few hours, where they could stop and ask and be directed. The asking was a fundamental act of pre-map travel. It was so fundamental that it is difficult to overstate its importance, precisely because it was so normal as to be largely invisible in historical accounts. Travelers did not typically record every instance of stopping to ask the way, for the same reason that people do not typically record every time they look something up in a reference book. It was the expected, normal mechanism of navigation, and it required a social infrastructure of people willing to stop and direct strangers. This social obligation to provide directions to travelers was recognized in various forms across different cultures. In medieval England, failing to give correct directions to a traveler who asked was considered a breach of social duty. In some Islamic traditions, the obligation of hospitality to travelers included the provision of whatever guidance they needed to continue their journey. The widely shared character of this norm suggests that it was a practical necessity recognized across many different societies, a form of informal collective infrastructure that kept the network of travel functioning. The people who gave directions in these exchanges were drawing on their own local knowledge, which was detailed and specific to their immediate area. A farmer in a valley who gave directions to a traveler heading for a market town knew the paths of his immediate area in considerable detail, including seasonal variations, current state of the tracks, and the particular landmarks that a stranger might find useful. He might know the road as far as the next village, beyond which his direct knowledge ended, and he would defer to what he had heard from others. This patchwork quality of local knowledge, dense and detailed in the immediate vicinity and thinning out with distance, was a natural feature of a world where most people's movements were locally bounded. The farmer who gave directions had probably never been to the market town himself. He knew the next stretch of road because he had walked it many times, and he knew who to send the traveler to ask in the next village. and that person would know the next stretch. And so the traveler would be handed along the route from one local knowledge to the next. The physical characteristics of a landscape provided a navigational framework that was available to anyone who knew how to read it, regardless of whether they had been in that specific place before. Rivers, hills, coastlines, and the edge of forests were the major structuring features of pre-map navigation across a wide range of environments and historical periods. Rivers were among the most useful navigational aids in pre-modern travel. A river is a linear feature that runs in a predictable direction and maintains that direction consistently through a landscape. Following a river downstream would inevitably lead to lower ground and eventually to the sea or to a larger river. Following it upstream would lead to higher ground and the watershed. Most major settlements in temperate Europe were on rivers because rivers provided water, transportation, and defensive positions, and the road networks of the pre-modern period were shaped by the river systems, following valleys where possible and crossing rivers at fords or bridges that became natural focal points of routes. A traveler who knew they needed to cross a river or who needed to reach a town known to be on a particular river could use the river as a navigational guide without needing any map. Find the river and follow it upstream or downstream until you reached the place you needed, or until you reached a point where a bridge or ford allowed you to cross. This was not always the fastest route, because rivers wind through landscapes in ways that add distance, but it was a reliable one. Hills and elevated ground were similarly useful. In a landscape with a visible ridge or range of hills, keeping those hills consistently on one side gave a reliable directional guide over substantial distances. A traveler who knew they needed to keep the hills to the east could maintain that orientation by simple observation, adjusting their course as the hills came and went from view. The specific shapes of hills, their profiles against the sky as seen from various points in the landscape, were recognizable features that served as landmarks for those who had traveled through an area before. The sky was a navigational tool of fundamental importance that was available anywhere and in any period. The sun's position in the sky provided a reliable directional reference during the day, with its arc from east to west giving constant information about direction and its height above the horizon, indicating the time of day. A traveler who had been moving since morning and observed that the sun was now in the southwest knew both the direction of southwest and approximately the time of afternoon, both of which were useful pieces of navigational information. The more detailed use of solar position for navigation required some understanding of its seasonal variation. The sun rises and sets at different points on the horizon, depending on the season, due north of east at midsummer in northern temperate latitudes, and south of east in midwinter. A traveler who was accustomed to using the sun's position as a directional guide had absorbed this seasonal variation through years of experience and could make allowance for it without needing to calculate explicitly. At night, the stars provided navigational information that was in some ways more precise than the sun's, because certain stars or star groups could give a fixed directional reference rather than the moving reference that the sun provided. The pole star, which sits very close to the north celestial pole and appears nearly stationary while all other stars rotate around it through the night, was known across cultures throughout Eurasia and North Africa as a reliable indicator of north. A traveler moving through a clear night in the pre-modern world could maintain a consistent northerly heading simply by keeping the pole star ahead. The constellations more broadly were read as a kind of seasonal and temporal calendar by people who paid attention to them, which in agricultural societies was a significant portion of the population. The rising of particular stars or star groups signaled the beginning of particular seasons, confirmed that the year was proceeding as expected, and provided a kind of temporal anchor in the landscape. This same intimate knowledge of the night sky provided navigational information to travelers who moved at night. Night travel was more common in the pre-modern world than might be expected, particularly in hot climates where daytime travel was physically difficult and in situations where moonlight provided enough illumination for road travel. A full moon on a clear night provides surprisingly good visibility for movement along a known path, and the additional navigational information provided by the star positions made night travel navigable for those who understood the sky. The landscape itself was read as a text by people who traveled through it regularly. The word landmark contains this idea that specific features in the landscape serve as marks, as information to travelers who know how to read them. But the reading of landscape that pre-map travelers engaged in was more comprehensive than the word landmark suggests, involving not just specific notable features, but the continuous interpretation of the environment as a source of directional and positional information. The orientation of a valley told you something about the drainage system it was part of, and therefore about the larger geography of the region. The character of the vegetation told you about the soil and moisture conditions, which in turn told you something about elevation and proximity to water. The presence of certain kinds of trees, certain kinds of plants, certain types of rock exposed at the surface. All of these were read by people who knew the landscape well as indicators of where they were and what kind of terrain lay ahead. These readings were not entirely the product of individual learning. They were also codified in the collective knowledge of a community and transmitted through that community's ways of talking about the landscape. Place names were one of the most important vehicles for this transmission. The names of places in England, in many cases names that have persisted for 1,000 years or more, encode information about the landscape features of the sites they refer to. Names that derive from Old English words for stream, for hill, for wood, for marsh, for ford are descriptions as well as names. And they gave the traveler who knew what they meant a continuous supply of landscape information. A road passing through a village called Sutton told you that the village was a south settlement, probably south of something larger. A place called Norton was a north settlement, eastern, western, and various combinations of these directional terms with the word for settlement or farm gave travelers a running commentary on the spatial relationships of the landscape. This is not to say that the naming of settlements was done primarily for navigational purposes. The names reflected the way communities understood and described their own locations. But the information they contained was useful to travelers, and the density of this kind of spatial information in the landscape's named features gave those who knew the language a navigational resource that was available everywhere settlements existed. The road networks of the pre-modern world were not arbitrary. They reflected accumulated generations of decision-making about the most practical routes through a landscape, taking into account the terrain, the river crossings, the location of settlements, and the seasonal conditions that affected different routes at different times of year. In England, the Roman road network, built for military and administrative purposes roughly 2,000 years ago, was still in use in the medieval period and for long after, because the Romans had done the work of finding practical routes through the landscape and building them with a solidity that outlasted the empire that built them. The straight lines of Roman roads cutting through the landscape according to a surveyed geometry rather than following the natural contours were a distinctive feature that even travelers who did not know the history of the roads could recognize. The pre-Roman track network, which the Romans had partly used and partly superseded, followed different principles. These older tracks tended to follow ridge lines where possible, because ridge lines offered several practical advantages. They drained well because water ran off the high ground rather than accumulating. They provided wide views of the surrounding landscape, which was useful for both navigation and safety. They avoided the difficulties of crossing rivers and negotiating valley floors, which could be boggy and flood-prone. And they ran along the natural high ground of the landscape, which tended to connect naturally from one elevated area to the next. The Ridgeway in Berkshire and Oxfordshire, which runs along a chalk ridge for 80 miles and which has been used continuously as a route since at least the Bronze Age, is a surviving example of this kind of Ridgeway track. Walking the Ridgeway, a traveler has views in both directions across the lower ground on either side, can see from many miles away what lies ahead, and can maintain a consistent direction simply by following the ridge. No map is needed for the Ridgeway because the land itself provides continuous directional information. Not all travel was on established roads or tracks, of course. In less densely traveled regions, the routes were more varied, and the traveler's own judgment about the most practical way through a piece of terrain was more important. This judgment was exercised differently depending on the traveler's experience and the nature of the terrain, and it was one of the skills that distinguished an experienced traveler from a novice. Medieval pilgrimage routes were among the most heavily traveled long-distance routes in Europe, and the infrastructure that developed around them reflects the practical requirements of navigation in this period. The routes to major pilgrimage destinations, Canterbury in England, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Rome and Jerusalem for those who traveled further, were not just roads, but systems of support that included waymarking, hospices, inns, and the accumulated knowledge of thousands of pilgrims who had gone before. The waymarking of pilgrimage routes took various forms: crosses or carved stones at key decision points. The intersections and forks where a traveler needed to choose a direction were common. In some cases, the marks on the stones indicated the direction of the destination. In others, the stone itself, or a particular kind of stone that was repeated at intervals, signaled that the traveler was on the right route. The scallop shell that became the symbol of the Camino de Santiago in Spain served partly as a personal badge of pilgrimage identity, but the same symbol carved on stones along the route was a waymark for those following it. The guides that accompanied important pilgrims in the early medieval period were people whose expertise was the route itself. They had walked it many times, knew where water could be obtained, knew which stretches were dangerous and which were safe, knew the hospices and resting places and the communities that welcomed pilgrims. This expertise was valuable enough to be paid for, and the guide who conducted a wealthy pilgrim from northern France to Compostela and back was performing a skilled service that had real commercial value. The guidebooks that were produced for pilgrims, some of the earliest travel literature in European history, codified this expert knowledge into written form. The Codex Calixtinus, compiled in the 12th century, includes a guide to the routes from France to Santiago that describes the roads in sequence, notes the river crossings, comments on the local people and their hospitality or lack of it, describes the terrain, and generally provides a textual itinerary that a literate pilgrim could use as a navigational resource. This was not a map, but it was navigational information organized for use by travelers, and it served the same practical purpose. The knowledge of routes was a form of property in the pre-modern world, in a sense that is easy to underestimate. A guide who knew a particular route well, who had the contacts at the stopping points along the way and understood the seasonal variations and the hazards and shortcuts, possessed something of real economic value. The merchants who organized trade caravans across the Sahara or along the Silk Road were paying not just for the physical labor of moving goods, but for the route knowledge and the contacts that made the journey viable. In the desert environments where caravan trade was most significant, the stakes of navigational error were particularly high because going wrong in a desert could mean running out of water before reaching the next source. The navigational systems used by desert travelers were refined over centuries, precisely because the consequences of getting it wrong were so severe. The Tuareg and other Saharan peoples who navigated the Great Desert developed navigational methods based on the same fundamental tools of sun and stars and wind that were available to travelers in other environments, but used with a precision and a depth of knowledge that reflected the desert's unforgiving character. The shape of sand dunes, which is determined by the prevailing wind direction, provided directional information. The stars were read with considerable precision, and the names given to specific star positions incorporated navigational information. The smell and character of the air, the temperature changes between different parts of the desert, the behavior of desert animals, all of these were read as sources of information by people who had grown up in this environment and learned to navigate it from an early age. The route knowledge of desert guides was not widely shared because it was the foundation of their economic position. A guide who taught all his knowledge to a client had given away the thing that made his services necessary. The route knowledge of the desert was accordingly maintained as a form of specialized expertise transmitted within families and professional groups, and protecting those who held it from being replaced. The sea, for maritime peoples, presented a navigational environment that was both simpler and more demanding than land navigation. Simpler because the ocean's surface, unlike land, did not have the complex three-dimensional topography of hills and valleys and rivers that land navigation had to deal with. More demanding because the ocean offered no fixed landmarks, no ability to ask someone the way, and no possibility of simply stopping and waiting for conditions to improve without being carried by currents and winds in whatever direction they happened to be blowing. The navigational methods developed by seafaring peoples before the compass and before reliable charts were the product of centuries of accumulated observation and experimentation, codified into bodies of knowledge that were transmitted through apprenticeship and practice. The Polynesian navigators who crossed the Pacific Ocean, discovering and settling islands spread across an area larger than Europe, did so without maps or instruments and without any of the navigational technology that European sailors would later develop. Their navigational systems were different from European ones, but were genuinely effective, capable of guiding vessels to small islands in the middle of a vast ocean with the kind of reliability that could support sustained colonization. Polynesian navigation used stars, wind, ocean swells, and the behavior of birds and marine life to maintain orientation and track position across vast distances. The swell patterns of the Pacific, driven by the prevailing winds and shaped by the presence of distant land masses, were read by navigators who lay in the bottom of their canoes to feel the subtle differences in motion that indicated different swell directions. A skilled navigator could detect the presence of an island below the horizon from the distortion it created in the swell pattern, confirming its location before it could be seen. The stars used by Polynesian navigators were organized into a mental map called the star compass, in which the horizon was divided into sectors corresponding to the rising and setting points of specific stars. By tracking which stars were rising in which sectors, the navigator could maintain a heading through the night with considerable accuracy. The star compass was memorized, not drawn, and it was transmitted orally through the communities that used it. The oral transmission of route knowledge was the primary means by which navigational information moved between people in most pre-literate societies. And it continued to be important even in literate societies where written guides and eventually maps were available. The limitations of written navigation guides, particularly their inability to reflect conditions that had changed since they were written, made the fresh local knowledge obtainable by asking someone always more immediately relevant than the contents of any document. The oral route descriptions that were passed from person to person in pre-map societies were not random collections of information. They had a characteristic structure that reflected the sequential nature of travel, the way a route unfolds in time and space as you walk or ride it. A typical oral route description would begin at a known starting point and proceed through a sequence of places and features in the order that a traveler would encounter them, with each element serving as both a waypoint to be confirmed and a trigger for the memory of what came next. This structure is similar to the structure of a modern narrative, with a beginning, a sequence of events in order, and an end. And the analogy is not entirely coincidental. The oral literature of many cultures includes narratives in which significant events occur at specific geographical places, and these narratives encode geographical information in a form that is memorable precisely because it is embedded in a story about something that happened at a particular river crossing, or at a particular hill, or at the place where two old tracks met. Was not just entertainment, it was also a way of remembering the existence and location of that feature for navigational purposes. The songlines of Aboriginal Australia are perhaps the most fully developed expression of this principle. The songlines are routes across the Australian landscape, maintained in the form of songs that describe the landscape in sequence as a traveler would encounter it, with the terrain features, the water sources, the significant locations, all encoded in the song. Knowing a songline meant knowing a route, and the network of songlines across the continent formed a navigational system that covered thousands of miles of landscape in a form that could be transmitted entirely without writing or drawing. The songlines were also connected to the spiritual and social landscape of Aboriginal culture in ways that went beyond pure navigation, but their practical utility as navigational tools was real, and was recognized as such by the communities that maintained them. The knowledge of a songline was simultaneously geographical knowledge, historical knowledge, and spiritual knowledge, all held in the same form and transmitted through the same practices. In the forests of North America, the indigenous peoples who lived there before European contact had developed navigational systems suited to an environment where the sky was often obscured by tree cover, where rivers and hills provided the primary structural features of the landscape, and where the distances to be traveled could be enormous. The trail system developed by various North American peoples over thousands of years connected communities across vast stretches of continent. These trails followed the most practical routes through the terrain, staying on well-drained ground, following ridges where possible, using natural passages through hills and mountains, and crossing rivers at the shallowest and safest points. The trails were maintained by use, by the feet of travelers, and sometimes by deliberate clearing, and they were marked in ways that gave directional and informational content to those who knew the system. Trail markers included bent or notched trees, where a branch had been bent in a particular direction, or a specific mark cut into the bark to indicate a turning point or a distance. Cairns of stones marked high ground and passes. Blazed trees with cuts in the bark at eye level indicated the route through dense forest, where the trail itself might be less obvious. These marks were not universally legible. Some were specific to particular groups and would not be interpreted correctly by members of other groups. But within the communities that created and used them, they provided a continuous navigational commentary on the route. The guides who accompanied early European explorers through North America were providing access to this accumulated navigational knowledge, often acquired over multiple generations. The routes the explorers followed were typically not new discoveries, but existing trails that had been used for centuries, and the ability of indigenous guides to navigate through landscape that appeared featureless to European eyes reflected the depth and specificity of the knowledge they had acquired. The trade networks of the pre-Columbian Americas were extensive and complex, moving goods over distances of hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles. Obsidian from specific volcanic sources in Mexico has been found in archaeological sites throughout North America, far from any source. Copper from the Great Lakes region moved south. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico moved north. The movement of these goods required the movement of people who carried them, and the routes along which they moved were maintained and known by the communities that used them. The management of long-distance trade routes required a kind of route knowledge that was more specialized than everyday local navigation. A trader moving goods from the Gulf Coast to the Ohio Valley was traveling through territory that was not all home territory, and the navigational knowledge required to do that safely and efficiently was more extensive than what an ordinary community member needed for daily life. The political and social arrangements that governed passage through different groups' territories were part of the navigational infrastructure of long-distance trade, in the sense that knowing you had safe passage through a particular area was as important as knowing the physical route. The relationships between trading communities, the established customs of safe conduct, the protocols for entering and leaving different territories were all part of what a long-distance trader needed to know. This social infrastructure of navigation, the protocols and relationships that allowed travelers to move through territories they did not control, was parallel to and intertwined with the physical infrastructure of trails and landmarks. Getting lost in a physical sense could sometimes be addressed by asking. Getting into difficulty through violation of social protocols about movement through territory was a different kind of problem. In the urban environments of the ancient and medieval world, navigation through city streets presented a different set of challenges and used different methods from cross-country travel. A city is, in some ways, a simpler navigational environment than open country because it is densely populated, and you are never far from someone who can tell you where to go. But a large and complex city with its dense network of streets that might not follow any consistent grid or direction could be genuinely difficult to navigate for a newcomer. Ancient Rome at its peak was a city of perhaps 1 million people, spread over a considerable area on both banks of the Tiber, with a street network that had grown organically over centuries without any consistent planning principle. The streets were narrow, often irregular, sometimes interrupted by large structures, and organized around a topography of hills and valleys that added an additional layer of complexity. A traveler trying to find a specific location in Rome without ever having been there before was facing a genuine navigational challenge. The Roman response to this challenge was not primarily cartographic. There were some maps of Rome produced in the ancient period, and the famous Forma Urbis Romae, carved in marble in the 3rd century, was a large-scale plan of the city. But this was not a navigation tool for the ordinary traveler. The practical navigation of Rome's streets was done through asking, through the knowledge of the landmarks that marked significant locations, and through the guidance of urban people who knew the city as their daily environment. The landmarks of Roman urban navigation included the temples, public baths, markets, theaters, and other large structures that were distributed through the city and that everyone knew. Giving directions in terms of these landmarks: turn left at the Temple of Saturn, go past the Baths of Agrippa until you reach the market, was the natural and effective method. The landmarks were known to all residents of the city, and they provided the reference points that made verbal direction-giving possible. Medieval cities in Europe grew on the foundation of Roman ones in many cases, and the organic street pattern that made them somewhat difficult to navigate was a product of incremental growth over centuries. The organization of medieval towns around specific functional areas, the butcher's street, the cloth market, the tanner's quarter, the Jewish quarter in many cases, gave a kind of implicit map structure to urban space that residents knew intuitively and newcomers learned quickly. The signs over shops and taverns in a pre-literate urban culture were not primarily written texts. Because many customers could not read, they were visual symbols, often three-dimensional objects hanging over the door that indicated the trade conducted within. A boot hanging outside meant a cobbler. A bush or garland indicated a tavern, the origin of the phrase "good wine needs no bush." A striped pole indicated a barber. These signs were both advertising and navigation aids. allowing people to find the kind of establishment they were looking for without needing to read or without needing to ask. The names of streets in medieval cities often encoded information about their function or their location that was useful for navigation. Streets named for the trades conducted in them, Bread Street, Milk Street, Ironmonger Lane, told a newcomer what to expect there. Streets named for their destinations, the road to the city gate that led north was often called something that indicated its destination, gave directional information embedded in the name. The person asking how to find the tanner could be told to go along Leather Lane and turn where you see the vats. These naming systems were not planned navigation infrastructure. They were the organic product of how people talked about the places they knew, and they reflected the practical needs of a world where knowing how to find a specific trade or a specific place was a daily requirement, but the result was a kind of navigational information distributed through the built environment in a form that could be absorbed through ordinary residence and use. The travelers of the ancient world who moved over the longest distances, the merchants who traveled the Silk Road between China and the Mediterranean, were operating within a system of route knowledge that was organized quite differently from the local knowledge of country people or the urban knowledge of city residents. The Silk Road, which is less a single road than a network of routes connecting various points along its length, extended across an enormous range of landscapes, from the temperate zones of China and the Mediterranean through the mountain barriers of Central Asia and the deserts of what is now Iran and Afghanistan. No single person knew all of it. The trade goods that moved along it were typically handed off from one group of traders to the next, each group operating within their own region of expertise. The specific sections of the Silk Road passed through the territories of specific peoples, whose guides and escorts were necessary for the journey through their territory. A Chinese merchant going to the edge of the known Chinese world would have passed the goods to Central Asian traders who took them to the oasis towns of Sogdiana. There, other merchants might take the goods further west. The navigational knowledge relevant to each section was held by the people of that section, and the overall system worked through the chain of handoffs, rather than through any single person's comprehensive knowledge of the whole route. The oasis towns along the Silk Road were as much navigational infrastructure as commercial infrastructure. Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, and the other towns of Central Asia were not just markets where goods changed hands. They were the nodes of the navigational network, the known points from which the next stage of the journey departed, maintained by the trade itself and by the communities that had grown up around it over centuries. The desert and steppe environments between the oasis towns required the most specialized navigational knowledge, because they were the sections where losing the way was most dangerous and where the environmental cues that guided navigation were least obvious to those who did not know them. The Karakum Desert between Merv and the Amu Darya River was navigated by routes that followed the rare water sources, and the knowledge of where those sources were located was among the most valuable navigational knowledge in Central Asia. In China, the development of navigational infrastructure had its own distinctive character, shaped by the specific needs of a centralized imperial state that administered a territory of enormous size. The network of imperial roads that connected the Chinese capital to the provinces required not just the physical roads, but a system for communicating position and distance along them. The Chinese road system included markers at regular intervals indicating cumulative distances from the capital, which gave travelers a consistent metric for their position along any given route. The Chinese also developed earlier versions of the compass. The first Chinese compasses, made from lodestone, a naturally occurring magnetic mineral, were used not for navigation but for geomancy, the practice of aligning buildings and burial sites with favorable directional orientations. The navigational application of the compass came later, and the transmission of compass technology to Europe via the Islamic world in the 12th and 13th centuries transformed maritime navigation in ways that eventually made long-distance oceanic navigation possible. But compass technology, even after its adoption, did not immediately change the fundamental character of pre-map navigation. The compass gave a reliable directional reference that was available in all weather conditions, day and night, without visibility of the sun or stars. This was a significant practical advantage, particularly at sea, but the compass did not provide any information about where you were in an absolute sense, only about which direction you were facing. Combining compass bearings with distance estimates and knowledge of the route's expected direction still required the same kind of accumulated route knowledge that all pre-map navigation depended on. Islamic geographers and travelers of the medieval period produced some of the most sophisticated geographical literature in the world between roughly the 9th and 14th centuries, including route books, regional geographies, and descriptive works that encoded an enormous amount of navigational information in textual form. The Kitab al-Masalik wal-Mamalik, the Book of Routes and Realms, was a genre of Islamic geographical literature that focused on routes between cities and the practical information relevant to travel between them. These books described the roads in sequence, noting the towns and stopping places, the distances between them, the conditions of the roads, the availability of water and food, and various other practical matters. They were not maps, but they were dense with navigational information. Ibn Battuta, the 14th century Moroccan traveler who spent nearly 30 years traveling through the Islamic world and beyond, reaching as far as Mali, China, and the Mali Empire, navigated his way through roughly 75,000 miles of travel without anything like a modern map. He used a combination of written route guides, the advice of local people, the guidance of local scholars, who formed a network across the Islamic world and provided hospitality and information to traveling scholars, and his own accumulated knowledge from decades of travel. The network of Islamic scholarship, which extended from Morocco to Indonesia and from Central Asia to West Africa, was itself a form of navigational infrastructure. A traveling scholar who reached a major city could expect to find the local scholarly community, who would provide accommodation, information, and introduction to the next stop. The personal networks built through this system of scholarly hospitality were more reliable guides than any document because they were current and personal and adaptive to the traveler's specific situation. Ibn Battuta's account of his travels, dictated at the end of his life, reads in part as a record of these introductions and connections. The sequence of local scholars and rulers who received him provided him with information about the next stage of his journey and sent him on with letters of introduction to their own contacts further along the route. The navigation of the physical landscape was inseparable from the navigation of this social landscape. The Vikings, whose maritime expansion between roughly 800 and 1100 extended across the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually the coast of North America, navigated without maps and without most of the instruments that later European sailors would depend on. Their navigational methods combined the astronomical orientation common to many maritime cultures with the specific deep knowledge of the North Atlantic environment. The latitude sailing method, in which you sail north or south until you reach the latitude of your destination and then turn east or west as required, was particularly suited to the North Atlantic environment and to the specific routes the Vikings traveled. Sailing from Norway to Iceland could be accomplished by setting a course due west at the right latitude, roughly the latitude of the Shetland Islands, and maintaining that course until land appeared. The distance was considerable, roughly 600 miles, but the method was reliable if the navigator could maintain the correct latitude. Maintaining latitude at sea without instruments required reading the position of the sun and stars with sufficient accuracy to detect deviation from the target latitude. Viking navigators developed and used a range of tools for this purpose. A sun compass, a flat disc with a gnomon at the center and lines marked on its surface, allowed the shadow of the sun to be compared to the expected position for a given latitude and time of day. The sunstone, possibly calcite crystals that can polarize light, may have been used to determine the position of the sun in overcast conditions by detecting the polarization pattern of the sky. Beyond instruments, the Vikings read the ocean environment for navigational information with the same systematic attention that Polynesian navigators brought to the Pacific. The ocean color, which varies with depth and with the presence of different phytoplankton communities, provided information about position relative to major current systems. The type and behavior of seabirds gave information about the direction and distance of land. Ice conditions in the far north, which varied predictably with the season and the prevailing currents, provided additional positional information to those who knew the patterns. The specific knowledge of coastal waters, the rocks and shoals, and tidal patterns of particular stretches of coast was among the most valuable and most carefully maintained navigational knowledge in the pre-map maritime world. Coastal navigation, because it involved sailing in close proximity to dangers that could destroy a ship in minutes, required a level of local knowledge that general astronomical navigation could not provide. The coastal pilots who guided vessels through difficult waters were specialists whose knowledge was specific to the water they worked in. The pilots of the Thames estuary, who guided vessels up and down the complex channels of that tidal and sandbank-ridden stretch of water, knew the specific names and positions of every significant feature, the channels, the banks, the tidal races, the rocks, in a detailed and specific way that could only be acquired through years of working in those specific waters. This pilot knowledge was partly explicit, in the sense that some of it could be described in words and was transmitted in verbal or written form through the communities of pilots. The sailing directions that were produced for specific stretches of coast from the late medieval period onward, called rutters or pilots from the French routier, were codifications of this kind of knowledge into a form that a literate navigator could use. They described the approach to a harbor in sequence, with the landmarks to look for, the depths to be expected at different states of the tide, the directions of the channels, and the hazards to be avoided. But a significant portion of coastal pilot knowledge was tacit, in the sense that it was held in the experienced body of the pilot rather than in explicit description. The feel of the water under the hull, the sound of surf indicating shoals before they were visible, the specific appearance of clouds and haze over particular pieces of coast that told an experienced eye where a vessel was. These were the kinds of knowledge that could not be easily written down and that were acquired only through extended experience. The development of more accurate maps and charts did not immediately displace these older forms of navigational knowledge. It supplemented them and eventually, over centuries, came to dominate them. But the transition was gradual and uneven. The Portolan charts produced in the Mediterranean from the 13th century onward were among the first genuinely cartographic documents to be used in regular navigation. These charts showed coastal outlines with considerable accuracy, covered with compass roses and rum lines, and they were used by Mediterranean sailors in combination with the compass to plan and execute coastal voyages. They were practical navigational documents, not decorative or administrative ones, and they were worn and stained with use. But Portolan charts represented only coastal outlines. The interior of the land masses they bordered was either blank or filled with schematic representations that had no navigational utility. The shift from coastal to interior cartography, the development of maps that accurately represented the land in its internal geography, came later and by a different process. The surveys that produced accurate interior maps of European countries were mostly conducted in the 16th through 18th centuries, and they depended on the development of survey instruments and methods that allowed distances and angles to be measured with sufficient precision to construct a geometrically accurate representation of a large area. Triangulation, the method of building up a survey from a network of measured angles and a few carefully measured baseline distances, was the key technique. And its systematic application to the mapping of territory was a slow and expensive process. The first accurate large-scale maps of England were produced in the 18th century, the most significant being the military survey conducted by the Ordnance Survey from 1791 onward. Before this, the maps available for England were either very small-scale and therefore very general, or they were county maps that had been produced to a higher standard but still with significant inaccuracies. The period between roughly 1700 and 1850 is therefore an interesting transitional one, when the production of increasingly accurate maps was beginning to change the character of navigation. But when the maps available were still limited and incomplete, and much navigation still depended on the older methods of asking, reading the landscape, and using accumulated local knowledge. John Ogilby's strip maps of English roads, published in 1675, were an early attempt to provide the traveling public with useful navigational documents. Ogilby's maps showed the roads of England as a series of scrolling strips, each strip showing a section of road in sequence, with the villages and landmarks along it marked. The format reflected the sequential nature of road travel, representing the road as a series of things to be encountered in order, rather than as a geometric feature on a two-dimensional plane. Ogilby's maps were practical tools and they sold well, but they were also schematic in ways that limited their utility in certain situations. The strip format showed each road in isolation, without showing how it related to the roads around it in a spatial sense. Traveler who wanted to know whether a detour was possible or whether there was a shorter route available by cutting across from one road to another could not easily determine this from the strip maps. The more familiar format of the regional map, showing a large area in its spatial relationships, was available in the late 17th and 18th centuries in various forms, but the accuracy of these maps was limited and the details sparse. A traveler planning a journey across a county could see the major towns and the major roads between them on such a map, but the secondary roads, the local paths, and the detailed topography that would affect the actual travel experience were typically not shown. For most travelers in this period, the practical experience of a journey was still shaped by the landscape and by the knowledge of local people far more than by any document. The coaching routes that connected London to the major provincial cities in the 18th century were the subject of regular turnpike maintenance, signpost installation, and milestone marking, all of which reduced the navigational burden on travelers using them. But these were the arterial routes, the most heavily traveled and most commercially important connections. Away from them, travel was still navigated in essentially the older way. Milestones, which indicated distances from specific towns along turnpike roads, were a form of navigational infrastructure that became common in England during the 18th century as a result of the turnpike legislation that required the turnpike trusts to maintain them. A milestone told a traveler how far they had come from a reference point and therefore, by subtraction, how far they still had to go. This was basic information, but it was not universally available even in the late 18th century. And in areas without turnpike roads, it was entirely absent. Signposts at road junctions indicating the direction and distance of nearby towns were similarly provided by turnpike trusts, and were similarly absent from non-turnpike roads. The legislation requiring their provision was passed in the late 17th century in England, but compliance was uneven and enforcement was limited. A traveler who left a turnpike road and entered the secondary network of country lanes was leaving the zone of navigational infrastructure and entering a world still governed by the old system of asking and local knowledge. The experience of travelers who left written accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries conveys something of what this world felt like in practice. Celia Fiennes, who rode through every county of England in the 1690s and left a detailed diary of her journeys, describes the experience of navigating through landscapes without reliable maps, with a matter-of-fact practicality that reflects how normal this was. She describes getting lost or nearly lost on multiple occasions, typically on stretches of moorland or in areas of dense forest where the tracks were unclear and landmarks were sparse. Her response was invariably to ask the first person she encountered, and the effectiveness of this strategy is evident from the fact that she completed her journeys. She also describes the usefulness of church towers and other elevated landmarks for maintaining orientation, and her close attention to the sun's position as a directional guide. What is notable in Fiennes's account is not the difficulty of navigation without maps, because she clearly managed perfectly well, but the continuous engagement with the physical and social landscape that this kind of navigation required. She was paying attention to the landscape in a way that a modern traveler following a GPS route does not need to. Every hill, every change in the track, every distant landmark, every person encountered on the road was potentially relevant to the question of where she was and how to get where she was going. This sustained attentiveness to the landscape is one of the things that distinguishes pre-map travel most clearly from its modern counterpart. Without a map or a navigation device, the traveler cannot offload the task of navigation to a tool. They must hold it themselves continuously for the duration of the journey. The landscape must be read as a text, the people encountered consulted as informants, the directional information available from sun and stars maintained in awareness. This is more cognitively demanding than following a navigation device's instructions, but it also produces a different and in some ways richer relationship with the landscape being traveled through. The development of route knowledge within a person's lifetime had a characteristic shape that reflected the typical structure of pre-modern life. In childhood, the known landscape was small, extending perhaps a mile or two from home in various directions. The child who walked to school, or to the next village, or to the fields where the animals grazed, was accumulating the dense local knowledge of the immediate environment that would be the foundation for all later navigational experience. As the person grew older and took on adult responsibilities that involved wider movement, the known landscape expanded outward from this core. The apprentice sent to a town to learn a trade walked the route and learned it. The young man who joined a merchant's household traveled with the merchant and learned the roots of the merchant's trading territory. The woman who married into a family in another village learned the route between the two villages and gradually extended her knowledge outward from the new home. At each stage, the new territory was connected to what was already known through the linking routes between familiar and unfamiliar. And the expansion of the known landscape happened incrementally, one connection at a time. The result, in an older person who had lived in a region their whole life and had made many journeys across it, was a knowledge of the landscape that was rich, specific, and organized in a mental structure that was shaped by the routes they had actually traveled, rather than by any geometrical representation. This knowledge was personal in the sense that it reflected the specific journeys of a specific individual, and it was also partly shared in the sense that the communities people lived in had collective knowledge of the regional landscape that was accessible through conversation and oral transmission. The shared knowledge of a community about its landscape was maintained through various practices of oral transmission that were part of the fabric of everyday social life. The conversations that occurred in markets, in inns, in the spaces where people gathered and talked, regularly included navigational information of various kinds. News from a traveler who had recently come from somewhere was as much about the condition of the roads and the hazards of the route as about the events at the destination. The market town was a node in the navigational knowledge network of a region in a way that went beyond its commercial function. People came to market from many directions, and they brought with them current knowledge of the routes they had traveled, the conditions of the roads, any unusual hazards or difficulties, any new construction or changes to the usual route. This knowledge was shared in the course of the ordinary conversations of market day, and it updated the regional knowledge stock with information about recent changes. The inn along a major road was similarly a place where navigational knowledge was exchanged and updated. Travelers arriving at an inn brought news of the road they had just traveled, and travelers preparing to continue their journey could obtain current information about the road ahead from those who had just come that way. The innkeeper, who saw travelers from both directions every day, accumulated a continuous stream of current navigational intelligence that made the inn a natural consultation point for travelers with questions about the road. This system of distributed, continuously updated navigational knowledge was resilient in ways that no document-based system could fully replicate. A map, once printed, could not update itself to reflect a bridge that had washed out, a new road that had been built, or a stretch of track that had become impassable after heavy rain. The oral knowledge network updated itself continuously as people traveled and reported what they found. The role of memory in pre-map navigation was central in a way that is easy to underestimate from a modern perspective, where memory has been externalized to such a large degree into documents and devices. Navigational knowledge that was not written down was held in people's memories, and the capacity to hold, organize, and retrieve navigational information was therefore an important cognitive skill with practical consequences. Various techniques for organizing and maintaining navigational memory were used across different cultures. The method of loci, an ancient Greek technique of memory organization in which items to be remembered are associated with specific locations along a familiar route, used spatial organization as the basis for memory in a way that reflects the deep association between navigation and memory. Remembering a route was, in some ways, the natural application of the spatial memory system that also underlies the method of loci. Place names, as mentioned earlier, were among the most important devices for encoding and transmitting geographical information, and their role in supporting navigational memory was significant. A person who knew the names of the places along a route and who knew what those names meant in terms of landscape features had a verbal memory aid that supported the spatial memory of the route itself. The practice of naming landscape features in the immediate environment, the specific fields and hills and streams and paths that made up the lived landscape of a community, created a verbal geography that supported navigational memory at the local scale. In England, the tithe maps of the early 19th century, which surveyed every field and recorded the name by which each was known locally, preserved for posterity a wealth of field names that reflected centuries of accumulated local naming practice. These names were the vocabulary of local navigational knowledge, the terms in which people thought about and remembered the landscape they moved through. Beyond the practical mechanics of navigation, there was a dimension of pre-map travel that was shaped by the emotional and psychological character of moving through an unfamiliar landscape without a complete picture of what lay ahead. The experience of genuine uncertainty about the route, of not knowing quite where you were or precisely what was coming next, was a normal part of travel before maps and before the communication systems that made long-distance information exchange possible. A traveler setting out from one town to another in the medieval period was relying on what they had been told, on what they could see, on what they could ask, and on the resilience to adjust when things did not go according to plan. The planning that preceded such a journey was accordingly different from modern travel planning. You could not look up the route on a reliable map, or check current road conditions, or know in advance exactly where you would stop each night. You could consult people who had made the journey recently, and their advice would be the best information available. You could obtain a written itinerary if one existed for the route. But the gap between the information you had before setting out and the information you would need was larger than in a world where comprehensive maps exist, and the successful completion of the journey required the capacity to bridge that gap through the resources available along the way. This capacity, the ability to navigate uncertainty through the continuous acquisition and integration of new information, was a practical skill that experienced travelers possessed to a high degree. The merchant who had made a particular journey 20 times knew not just the route but also the range of variation that could occur, the alternative routes available if the main one was blocked, the people who could be relied on for good information at various points, the signs that indicated particular kinds of difficulty ahead. This accumulated experience transformed the uncertainty of the journey into a manageable set of contingencies. The experience of being genuinely lost, rather than merely uncertain, was different in kind from modern lostness. In most inhabited landscapes, genuine lostness was temporary. You were lost until you found a road, until you saw a church tower above the trees, until you encountered a person who could tell you where you were. In the densely settled lowland landscapes of medieval and early modern Europe, sustained lostness was relatively uncommon precisely because the landscape was full of people and visible features that could reorient a confused traveler. Lostness was more serious in the less populated environments, the high moorlands, the dense forests, the mountains, the deserts. In these places, the person who got lost might not find another person for hours or days, and the consequences of continued disorientation could be severe. The stories that accumulate around these landscape types in the folklore of many cultures reflect this real danger. The forest in the European fairy tale tradition is consistently the place where one can get lost, where the normal rules of orientation do not apply, and where one needs help or special knowledge to find the way through. The mountains of the Alps, which had to be crossed for trade and travel between Italy and northern Europe, were places that required very specific local knowledge and guide services that were recognized as essential. The hospices established at mountain passes by religious orders, most famously the great St. Bernard hospice that was already in operation in the early medieval period, were partly way stations providing food and shelter, but they were also sources of guides who knew the high alpine passes and could lead travelers safely through conditions that were genuinely dangerous for those without the knowledge. The alpine guides were specialists in a highly specific navigational environment where the weather could change rapidly, where the routes through the high passes required the selection of specific lines through terrain that looked similar in all directions, and where a wrong turn could lead to a glacier or a cliff rather than to the next valley. Their knowledge was local and specific and non-transferable to other environments, and it was valued accordingly. The religious dimension of travel in the medieval period was not entirely separate from its navigational dimension. The major pilgrimage routes were marked with shrines and chapels at regular intervals, and these were landmarks as well as spiritual stations. The shrine at a major crossroads or at a key landmark served simultaneously as an object of devotion and as a waypoint on the route. And the traveler who knew the distribution of shrines along a route had a navigational framework as well as a devotional one. The crosses erected at crossroads and at other significant points on the landscape, often called way markers or crossroads crosses, were a feature of the medieval English and French landscape that provided both spiritual and navigational function. They marked the intersection of routes, indicated the significance of a particular spot, and provided a landmark that could be named and referred to in giving directions. When a cross was also an old boundary marker, as many were, its navigational significance was multiplied, because boundaries between parishes or manors were themselves significant features of the landscape that were maintained in collective memory. The boundaries of parishes, which defined the territory within which a community's religious life was organized, were walked and confirmed at regular intervals through the practice of beating the bounds. This annual or periodic procession around the parish boundary was a ritual act with practical consequences, because it confirmed the knowledge of the boundary in the memory of those who participated. Young people were taken along specifically so that the knowledge would be transmitted to a new generation, and at particularly significant boundary markers, memorable events, mild hazing of the young participants were used to ensure that the location would be remembered. The boundary knowledge maintained through beating the bounds was a kind of collective navigational memory applied to the specific need of knowing where a community's territory began and ended. The people who had participated in this ritual knew the parish boundary not just as an abstract line on any notional map, but as a sequence of specific places encountered in order, with specific visual and tactile memories attached to each. The relationship between political authority and geographical knowledge was one of the important dynamics shaping the development of cartography. States that wanted to administer and tax their territory found that accurate knowledge of the land was useful, and the production of maps was often connected to administrative and military projects rather than to the needs of ordinary travelers. The Domesday Book, compiled in England in 1086 on the orders of William the Conqueror, was a comprehensive survey of the land and its resources undertaken for administrative and fiscal purposes. It was not a map, but it was a geographical document of a kind that reflected the state's interest in systematic knowledge of its territory. The information it contained was organized by administrative unit, county, and hundred and manor, rather than spatially in the way a map would organize it, but the underlying project of comprehensive territorial documentation was a significant piece of administrative geography. The military surveys that produced the first accurate large-scale maps of various European countries were similarly state projects, motivated by the military need to understand and manage territory. The Ordnance Survey in England, the Carte de Cassini in France, the surveys that preceded the production of accurate military maps of the German states, all were organized and funded by states rather than by private commercial interests, because the cost and complexity of accurate large-scale survey was beyond what commercial publishers could sustain. The public availability of the maps produced by these surveys was not automatic. Military maps were often kept restricted because their content was considered sensitive information that should not be made available to potential enemies. The decision to make maps publicly available reflected a judgment that the commercial and navigational benefits of public maps outweighed the military risks of allowing potential enemies to study them. And this judgment was made at different times in different countries. The people for whom these early modern maps were most significant were not the ordinary travelers who continued to navigate by asking and by reading the landscape for many decades after accurate maps became available. They were the educated elites who could read maps, who could afford the considerable price of printed maps, and who had the intellectual background to interpret what they showed. The gentleman traveler of the 17th and 18th centuries was more likely to have a map and to use it than the carrier or the drover or the peddler, who traveled more often but with different resources. The grand tour, the extended educational journey through Europe that was a standard part of the formation of young gentlemen of the English upper classes in the 18th century, was typically navigated with the aid of printed guides and some maps, as well as the services of local guides in places where the routes were complex. But even for these more privileged travelers, the map was one tool among several rather than the comprehensive solution to all navigational questions. The roads shown on available maps were not always the current roads. The towns shown were not always accurately placed. The distances indicated were approximations. A traveler who trusted a map entirely and refused to modify its information in the light of what local people said or what the landscape showed was a traveler who would get into difficulty. The supplement of local knowledge to map knowledge was a recognized necessity, and the traveler who arrived in a town and sought out local advice about the next stage of the journey was not displaying ignorance but exercising good judgment. The combination of map knowledge, which gave a broad framework of spatial relationships and approximate routes, with current local knowledge, which gave specific and up-to-date information about actual conditions, was more effective than either alone. The experience of travel in landscapes that are genuinely unmapped is still available in the modern world in a few places, and travelers who have had this experience describe it in ways that resonate with the older navigational world. Moving through a landscape without a map, without GPS, and without any document that purports to show you where you are, requires a different quality of attention from that which modern navigation typically demands. The landscape itself becomes more present, more demanding of interpretation. The direction of the sun, the slope of the ground, the direction of drainage, the presence of tracks made by people or animals, the visibility of high ground that might provide a wider view, all of these become active objects of attention rather than background scenery passed through while following a navigation device's instructions. This is not a romantic claim that pre-map travel was better than modern navigation. It was slower, more uncertain, and sometimes more dangerous. The development of accurate maps and eventually of precision navigation tools has made travel vastly more efficient and has opened up regions that were previously inaccessible to all but the most skilled and experienced travelers. What it has also done is to redistribute the work of navigation from the traveler's own mind to an external tool. And this redistribution has changed the experience of travel in ways that are worth understanding. The relationship between the traveler and the landscape, when the traveler is actively navigating without external help, is a relationship of continuous attention and interpretation. The landscape is not background, it is foreground, a continuous source of information that the traveler must read and integrate and respond to. This active engagement with the landscape as a navigational object is what pre-map travel consistently required, and it is one of the things that most distinguishes it from modern navigation. The navigational systems of maritime peoples who lived near open ocean and who navigated without instruments or charts for long periods developed in ways that reflect the specific character of ocean navigation. The Marshall Islands navigators of the Pacific, who are among the best documented of the world's non-instrument navigators, developed a system of stick charts that encoded information about swell patterns and island positions in a form that could be read and used. The stick charts, made from curved and straight sticks lashed together at specific angles and positions, with small shells representing islands, were not used at sea as navigation aids in the way a chart would be used. They were learning devices used on land to teach and reinforce the mental model of the swell patterns and island positions that a navigator needed to hold in their head. The actual navigation was done from that mental model, not from the physical stick chart, which would have been impractical to use in the conditions of an ocean voyage. This distinction between the device used for learning and the mental model used for navigation is important. The knowledge that the Marshall Islands navigators used was held in their minds, organized through years of instruction and practice, and expressed in the physical movements of their bodies. The adjustments they made to the canoe's course in response to the swell patterns they felt and saw. The stick chart was a pedagogical tool, not a reference document, and its role in the navigational system was fundamentally different from the role of a chart in a modern maritime navigation system. The transmission of this kind of navigational knowledge through apprenticeship was a slow and intensive process. A young navigator in the Marshall Islands tradition would spend years learning the swell patterns, the star positions, the island locations, and the reading of wind and weather from an experienced navigator, typically a family member, in a process that combined formal instruction with the accumulated experience of many voyages. By the time the apprentice was considered ready to navigate independently, the knowledge was deeply embedded in their perception and judgment in a way that could not be acquired quickly. The navigational knowledge of indigenous peoples throughout the Pacific and of maritime peoples in other parts of the world was not inferior to European navigation in any absolute sense. It was different, adapted to the specific environments and the specific navigational problems of the communities that developed it. In the specific environment of the open Pacific, where islands were small and widely scattered, and where the navigational challenge was to find a specific island in a vast ocean, the Polynesian and Micronesian navigational systems were genuinely effective in ways that the European systems of the same period were not. European navigators of the 15th and 16th centuries, who were beginning their own sustained ocean voyages, were working with a combination of compass, sandglass for timekeeping, the astrolabe and later the quadrant for measuring celestial altitudes, and the pilot's traditional knowledge of coastal waters. What they lacked, and what would not be provided until the 18th century, was a reliable way to determine longitude, and the absence of longitude made their open ocean navigation fundamentally uncertain in a way that shaped everything else about it. The longitude problem, as it was known, was the defining navigational challenge of the age of sail, and its eventual solution through the development of the marine chronometer in the mid-18th century was a landmark in the history of navigation. The chronometer allowed mariners to carry accurate Greenwich time with them, and from the difference between Greenwich time and local noon time, they could calculate their longitude directly. The mathematics was straightforward once the instrument existed. The difficulty had been making an instrument accurate enough to maintain Greenwich time through weeks and months of a sea voyage without cumulative error. The period between the development of the chronometer in the 1760s and the widespread adoption of printed accurate charts for most of the world's waters, which extended well into the 19th century, was a transitional one in which navigational capability was improving rapidly but unevenly. The Royal Navy's Hydrographic Office, established in 1795, began the systematic survey of the world's waters that would eventually produce charts reliable enough for confident navigation, but the work of surveying took decades, and until a piece of water had been surveyed and charted, it remained navigated in the older way. The surveying vessels that conducted this work, most famously HMS Beagle, on which Charles Darwin sailed as naturalist, were engaged in a patient and methodical process of measuring the depths, the coastlines, the hazards, and the geographic positions of the waters they surveyed, and converting this information into charts that would be available to all subsequent navigators. The work was not dramatic, but it was consequential, systematically replacing the uncertain local knowledge of coastal pilots and the accumulated experience of specific route sailors with objective measurements that could be shared across the maritime world. A chart of a harbor or a strait, once made and published, made the local pilot's knowledge accessible to any mariner who could obtain the chart. The specialized knowledge that had been held in the pilot's head, acquired through years of personal experience in those specific waters, was replaced by a document that any competent navigator could read and use. This democratization of navigational knowledge was one of the significant consequences of the development of accurate cartography, and it gradually reduced the value and the necessity of the highly specialized local knowledge that had been central to pre-map navigation. The transformation in how people related to geographical knowledge was not only about navigation, it was also about how people understood their position in the world, their relationship to places they had never been, and the nature of the geographical imagination. Before maps were widely available and widely used, the mental geography of most people was centered on their own experience, and on what they had heard from others. The places they knew were real and specific, and the places they had not been to were known only through descriptions, which might be accurate or might be highly distorted by the limited information available and by the tendency of oral transmission to shape stories towards the interesting and memorable. The edges of the known world were genuinely uncertain, not just in the sense that maps showed them as blank, but in the sense that no one in a given community might have reliable information about what was there. The medieval Mappae Mundi, the world maps that were produced in European monasteries, and that placed Jerusalem at the center of the world and surrounded it with a mixture of real and imagined geography, reflect a mental model of the world that was organized around theological significance and inherited textual authority, rather than around the results of systematic survey. These maps were not intended as navigational tools. They were representations of a cosmological worldview, and their content reflected that purpose rather than any intention to guide travelers. The sea monsters in the margins were not warnings about specific oceanic hazards. They were markers of the limits of the known and of the theological imagination of what lay beyond. The shift from this kind of cosmological geography to a more purely empirical geography, organized around measurement and observation rather than theological significance, was one of the intellectual transformations of the early modern period, connected to the broader intellectual changes that are sometimes called the scientific revolution. The development of cartography as a discipline based on measurement and increasingly on systematic survey was part of this shift. As accurate maps became more widely available through the 18th and early 19th centuries, they changed not just how people navigated, but how they thought about the landscape. Having a map that showed the spatial relationships between places that you had never seen together from any viewpoint allowed a kind of understanding of the landscape that was previously available only to very experienced travelers, or to those who had specifically sought to understand the regional geography. A farmer in a valley who had never been beyond the local market town could, with a county map, understand for the first time the spatial relationships between his valley and the next, the way the rivers ran between the hills, the positions of the towns he had heard of but never visited. This was a new kind of geographical knowledge, abstract and schematic compared to the embodied knowledge of a walked route, but capable of representing spatial relationships that the walked route did not make available. The consequence was a gradual shift in how geographical knowledge was held and transmitted. The spatial mental models that people built up from walked experience were still important and still form the basis of local navigational knowledge for most people for many generations after accurate maps became available. But the map-based representation of geography increasingly became the reference framework within which all other geographical knowledge was situated. A place was no longer located primarily by its position in a sequence of places along a route from somewhere else. It was located by its position on a map, by coordinates, by its relationship to a grid of measurement that was independent of any particular route or any particular traveler's experience. This was a profound shift in the epistemology of place, in how the location and character of places was known and communicated. The surveyors who made the accurate large-scale maps of the 19th century were conducting an activity that was both practical and conceptually transformative. Their work required movement through the landscape in a way that was different from the movement of travelers, because the surveyor's goal was not to reach a destination, but to measure the landscape comprehensively. They moved along baselines, set up instruments at carefully selected stations, measured angles and distances with instruments whose precision was the result of generations of instrument makers' craft, and gradually built up a network of measured points from which the whole landscape could be computed. The triangulation networks that underlay the major national surveys were feats of both scientific and physical work. Establishing a triangulation station on a mountain or a hill required not just getting there, which in some cases involved serious effort in rough terrain, but also setting up and using instruments with the precision needed for the survey to be useful. The measurements had to be made when the atmosphere was stable enough for the sights to be clear, which meant working at specific times of day and waiting through bad weather when observation was impossible. The surveyors of the Ordnance Survey, working across Britain through the early 19th century, spent years in the field making the observations that eventually became the accurate maps available to the public. Their work was systematic and cumulative, building up the survey county by county, and the maps that resulted represented an investment of sustained scientific labor that had no equivalent in the pre-map world. What was lost in the transition from pre-map to map-based navigation was not, in any important sense, recoverable, because it was not a document or a technology, but a way of paying attention. The continuous engagement with the physical landscape that pre-map navigation required, the reading of terrain and sky and light and the behavior of plants and animals and water as sources of directional information, was a skill that diminished when it was no longer necessary for practical navigation. This is not a lament exactly. The development of accurate navigation technology, from the marine chronometer to GPS, has made possible human activities, from oceanic trade to aviation to space exploration, that would not have been possible within the older navigational systems. The practical benefits are real and large, but the cognitive and perceptual changes that accompanied the development of navigation technology were real too, and they changed not just how people found their way, but how they experienced the landscapes they moved through. A traveler navigating without a map, like the man at the road fork at the beginning of this narration, had a relationship with the landscape that was active and interpretive in every moment. The landscape was speaking in the language of slope and light and water and track, and the traveler was listening. This kind of listening, maintained over a lifetime of travel, produced a quality of environmental knowledge that was specific, embodied, and deeply practical. The farmers, carriers, drovers, chapmen, and various other people who made their living in motion through the pre-map landscape accumulated this kind of knowledge as a matter of course, not because they were particularly interested in geography, but because their work required it. The drover who moved cattle from Wales to the markets of London, along routes that had been used for centuries for exactly this purpose, knew those routes as a professional body of knowledge. The droving routes of Britain, which crossed the landscape by somewhat different paths than the main roads because cattle needed to graze as they moved and therefore needed routes with sufficient grass verge, were maintained in the collective knowledge of the droving community. The Welsh drovers, who formed a significant element of the British cattle trade through the 18th century, followed routes that were known through the community of drovers, modified by seasonal conditions, and occasionally adjusted in response to changes in land use and enclosure that affected the availability of grazing along the way. The drovers also served as carriers of information and small goods along their routes, filling an early postal and transport role in the areas they traveled through. A drover who was going to London from Wales would carry letters and small parcels for people along the route, deliver and collect messages, and return with news from London and from the various communities along the way. Their navigational knowledge was therefore part of a broader economic and social function that made them important nodes in the information network of the regions they moved through. The chapmen, or itinerant merchants who sold small goods from packs carried on their backs or on pack animals, navigated a circuit of markets and fairs that took them through a region on a regular schedule. Their route knowledge was commercial as well as physical, because knowing which markets were held on which days and planning a circuit that allowed attendance at multiple markets while keeping travel distances manageable was a logistical problem as well as a navigational one. The chapman's pack contained goods suited to the needs of rural communities, needles and thread, buttons, ribbons and lace, pins, small tools, cheap books and broadsheets. and various other items that were not easily obtained in remote areas. Their arrival in a village was an event because they brought goods that were otherwise hard to find and also brought news from elsewhere on their circuit. The intelligence they carried about road conditions, about which areas had been affected by floods or other disruptions, and about the general state of travel along their routes was as valuable to local communities as their commercial goods. The knowledge of a chapman who had been working the same regional circuit for 20 years was a comprehensive navigational resource for that region, the kind of knowledge that took years to build and could not be quickly acquired or easily communicated to someone who had not made the same journeys. It was held in the body as much as in the mind, in the trained assessment of how long a stretch of road would take, in the automatic recognition of landmarks, in the reading of weather signs that had been tested against experience over many years. The night sky that guided navigators on land and sea, that provided the fixed points of the pole star, and the seasonal positions of other stars to travelers moving through darkness, was itself read differently by people who depended on it than by those who did not. The stars were named, and the names were connected to stories that helped people remember the positions and characters of the constellations. These stories were not merely entertainment, they were memory systems for astronomical information, encoding the positions, the rising and setting times, and the seasonal appearances of the major stars and constellations in a form that could be transmitted orally and retained without writing. The Pleiades, the tight cluster of stars visible in winter in the northern hemisphere, were used across many cultures as a seasonal calendar marker, with their rising at specific times of night indicating specific seasons and the appropriate agricultural activities for those seasons. A farmer who knew the Pleiades knew when to plant and when to harvest, organized not by a written calendar but by the observable sky. The same star cluster might also provide navigational information to a traveler who knew that it rose in a specific direction at a specific time of year. This dual function of astronomical knowledge, as both calendar and compass, was characteristic of how pre-literate communities integrated geographical and temporal knowledge into a unified body of practical understanding. The sky was not just a navigation tool, it was a comprehensive information system that provided information about time, season, direction, and through the patterns of weather that were correlated with astronomical conditions, about likely future weather as well. The transmission of this knowledge from generation to generation was accomplished through the practices of everyday life in ways that did not require formal instruction as a separate activity. Children who grew up in farming communities learned to read the sky through the conversations and activities of agricultural life, through watching adults interpret the weather and the seasons, through the stories told in the evenings that encoded astronomical information. The knowledge was absorbed as part of learning how to live in the community, inseparable from the other practical and social knowledge that was transmitted in the same way. The same was true of navigational knowledge more broadly. A child growing up in a coastal fishing community learned the local waters through accompaniment on fishing trips from an early age, gradually acquiring the specific knowledge of channels and rocks and tidal patterns that was the navigational foundation of the community's livelihood. The knowledge was not taught as a subject, but accumulated through experience, structured by participation. The kind of learning that anthropologists sometimes call legitimate peripheral participation, in which the learner gradually moves from the periphery toward the center of a community of practice by participating in its activities at increasing levels of responsibility. This mode of knowledge transmission was extremely effective for the kind of tacit, embodied, situationally specific knowledge that pre-map navigation required, precisely because it transmitted not just information but also the perceptual skills and judgments that allowed the information to be applied. The navigator who had learned by doing could read the sky or the water or the landscape in an integrated and flexible way that reflected deep familiarity with the actual experience of navigation, not just an abstract model of it. As this narration has moved through the various landscapes and methods and communities of pre-map navigation, a consistent picture has emerged of a world in which geographical knowledge was distributed differently from how it is in a world saturated with maps and navigation devices. The knowledge was held in people's minds and bodies, transmitted through practice and oral exchange, dense and specific near home, and thinner and more uncertain far from it, continuously updated by the movement of people through the landscape and their subsequent reporting of what they found. The practical consequence was that travel required a different kind of engagement from the traveler than it does today, and that the landscape was experienced differently as a result. The man at the road fork, choosing between two tracks without any document to consult, was not lost. He was navigating, using the tools available to him, which were the direction of the light, the character of the terrain, his knowledge of where he was going and what kind of landscape he expected to find before he got there, and his experience of similar decisions made before. He took the right-hand track and kept walking through the open land and toward the long afternoon ahead, the sky giving him direction and the track giving him course, and the landscape speaking in its ordinary way to anyone who had learned to listen. The market was 2 days ahead. He had walked this kind of distance before. The track felt right under his feet, and the light was still good, and there was time before dark to make enough progress that the stopping place he knew, a settlement where he had rested on a previous journey, would be reachable before night came in. He walked, and the landscape continued to inform him in its quiet and continuous way, and he continued to read it, as travelers had always done.